So here we are back on our machine dc.company.pri, where we can launch the Group Policy Management console and then just take a look at an example group policy. I'll pop up here into the default domain policy because we're not actually going to be configuring much here in default domain. If I pop down here under computer configuration and take a look at the administrative templates, you've probably poked around in here a little bit. If you haven't, just spend some time taking a look at all the different settings that exist. If I click down here under all settings, you can see all of those settings in a single flat file view, where you can get very easily overwhelmed at just the sheer number of total settings that exist just straight out of the box. Now, thankfully, Microsoft provides here with these property filters the abilities to just tailor down exactly which group policy settings that you're taking a look at. And if I come back over here and right-click on the admin templates folder, I can create the filter right here. Now it's here this filter where we have a couple different just categories that we can enable for the types of settings we're interested in looking at. The first of which being the middle one right here being the keyword filters. So if you know you're interested in managing some aspect of, I don't know, the desktop, you can punch in a word here to filter on that word in either the policy setting title, in the help text, or also over here in the comments field. Now, I should mention that these comments fields are fairly easy to overlook, but they provide a really excellent way for you to identify perhaps information about why a particular group policy setting was configured, or who configured the setting, or when the setting was configured. I've also seen this comment field used before to identify the work order number that was used to identify the permission or the approval for actually configuring this GPO setting. The comments are found up here, and if you just punch in anything here, it will populate that with that information. It's a complete free-form field for you to do with whatever you wish. But I found certain environments that make use of this, again, to tie the group policy setting and its enabling to either a person or a time or a work order so that you have an idea over time of why this group policy setting was configured. Now back here to our filters, when we go back and take a look at the filters here, we can then filter then on the words that were in that comment field, or up here, the fact that a comment was even entered into the group policy setting. Also down here, we can enable a requirements filter, which allows us to ensure that we're only taking a look at the group policy settings that are relevant for a particular version of either the OS or an application on top of that OS. If you have an environment where you have multiple different operating system versions, if you have an environment where you're perhaps not at the most recent version of the OS, these different requirements filters provide a great way to ensure that you're not configuring some GP setting that cannot actually be configured on the machines you're targeting that GPO to. You also here in this filter options screen have the ability to filter on whether or not the setting was even configured or not. So if you just want to take a look at those settings that have actually been configured and enabled, you can do so here. Now, the last one of these is the one that's perhaps the most important because group policy settings come in two different flavors. On one side, you have the managed GP settings. On the other side, you have the unmanaged GP settings. Those that are managed look very much the same as those that are unmanaged, but there's a very important difference between the two. A managed group policy setting will actually be removed or reverted back to its original configuration when the computer or user that this GPO is assigned to is no longer within the scope of the GPO. Now, that's a lot of words, but if you think about a group policy object, you can configure that GPO to point to a certain organizational unit. That organizational unit may have users or computers in it. When managed group policy settings are configured into a GPO that's applied to an organizational unit, if that user or computer for some reason moves to another OU, well, then that managed setting will be reverted back to its previous configuration. Now, whereas the managed settings are important, it's actually the unmanaged settings that can really come back to bite you if you're not aware of them. Here, if you choose managed equal no, you can identify the relatively small list here of settings that will not be reverted if that computer ends up moving to another OU or if that user moves to another OU. These unmanaged settings are permanent. And the only way to get those settings to revert back to a previous configuration is to create another group policy object that specifically reverts that configuration. So you definitely want to be careful here with these managed versus unmanaged settings because the unmanaged settings are those that can be difficult to rip out of an environment once configured.